A world without Dracula? Thank you very much for being here. May is the month where World Dracula Day happens, which is the day where we celebrate the publication of the book Dracula over 125 years ago. And this particular World Dracula Day, I thought it would be a good excuse to get together with somebody who is a friend of mine, but whom I have never actually done a joint episode with. So today we are joined by Brian Forrest of Toothpickings. He is not only does he have a YouTube channel, but he also blogs, he lectures, he is a researcher who has come up with some amazing revelations about the origin of the vampire in literature, as well as, I think it's safe to say that he is probably the foremost authority on Blacula, the movie Blacula, right now. And so this is somebody who I have been following his work for a very long time, and I'm very excited to basically share an episode with Brian of Toothpickings. So thank you for being here, Brian.
Thank you, Sean. I'm thrilled to be here. I've loved your channel for a long time, and we've sort of exchanged notes here and there over the years. But yeah, it's high time we actually shared a screen like this. And I should say, I would qualify your praise. Thank you very much for that. But I would qualify. I think I might be the leading expert on Blacula who didn't actually work on the film.
I mean, that's a very important asterisk to put on there. And that's a very good point in the fact that so many of the people who made that film are still alive. And
there's a few,
I'm actually going to ask Brian a bunch of questions about this after we get done with our main topic today, because I'm very curious myself. So you can look forward to that at the end of the episode. But this is actually, we're going to be discussing Dracula, and this was a topic that Brian suggested that I fell in love with, and that is, what would the world be like without Dracula in it? So we're going to be discussing a world without Dracula today. Let's just dive right into this. Like, what are we looking at a world without Dracula?
I think the TLDR version is that we would still have vampires, but they would probably be relegated to the same status as the Mummy or the Invisible Man. You know, a mythical monster who still shows up once in a while, but is not as ubiquitous as they are now. There would not be whole shelves and bookstores dedicated to vampire fiction had there not been a Dracula. I think that's the shortest answer. I think we can now go into a much longer answer after that.
That's a very good point, because obviously there were vampires, in literature, to say nothing of actual vampire beliefs in Eastern Europe stretching back centuries. But Dracula was not the first vampire book. In fact, it was the result of sort of I don't know if you would call it a vampire literary craze, but it was definitely kind of a movement.
It was almost the climax of close to a century of build-up of vampire fiction and literature and poetry. And yes, there had been vampires before Dracula. There would have been vampires after Dracula. There were vampires created the same year as Dracula, who have the very, very unfortunate status of having to exist that same year and be completely overlooked.
I don't know who these vampires are. Do you who are we talking about?
Oh gosh, I couldn't give you names, but Florence Marriott had a book called The Blood of the Vampire. I've never read it. I've been warned that it is horribly racist, so I never dealt with it, even though I'm kind of curious about it. but I haven't gotten actually around to reading it. There was a Rudyard Kipling poem that came out that same year that had to do with some vampires. I don't think any of them were named as vampires. And there was a Munch painting that came out that same year. That's you've seen it. It's quite famous. I think it's usually called The Vampire's Kiss or The Vampire's Embrace, even though
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe that was the title he gave it. So
Gotcha.
that might be the second most famous vampire property to come out in 1897, the year that Dracula dropped. But yes, there had, of course, been vampires before Dracula, and there had been what we would call a Byronic vampire. And I don't want to talk down to your audience, but Byronic
No, no, no.
vampire.
Please
Um,
tell us about the Byronic vampire for those who have never heard of it before.
well, dictionary definition, loosely based on Lord Byron. Uh, Easier definition: any vampire who is super good looking, very magnetic. People want to be with them or be around them, regardless of whether it's hypnotism or if it's just their own sort of personality. They dress really well. They probably have a lot of money. They are very distinguished. That's Byronic. And
Gotcha.
it is the most popular kind of vampire ever created. We occasionally get other experiments with what a vampire could be, but the hit that just keeps on hitting is the Byronic vampire.
That's a very good way of putting it.
And
And
that's what
that,
Dracula was.
for
Dracula was
sure.
following that mold that had already been established of this regal, noble vampire of great wealth, very distinguished, um, the sort of man that women were uncontrollably attracted to, that men were fearful of. That sort of mold was what Bram Stoker was playing with. He wasn't completely reinventing the vampire at all. He was taking a lot of what had already been established, was already floating around in the ether, added a few of his own sprinkles to it, of course, and did it better than anyone had done it before. But it was a mold that had existed and probably would continue to exist had Dracula not come along. It
Well, and
just so
that's
happened that Dracula was such a smash, both as a book and later as a movie, that it established a mindset amongst everybody that this is what a vampire should be.
you raise an excellent point. The book itself was, from what I, and correct me if I'm wrong because this is not my field of expertise, but the book was not like a runaway bestseller or anything when it was published. It did sell well enough to where it kept being published, but it wasn't until the Bela Lugosi movie came out that like the entire zeitgeist happened around Dracula. Am I misrepresenting that or?
I think I think both are fair to say. It did sell well. It
Oh, it
was
did. Okay.
pretty, yeah. Listen, what could you possibly compare it to from the 1800s? What would have I don't know that it was Pride and Prejudice, but it sold. Like you said, it stayed in print. Any book that stays in print is obviously doing well. But I also think you're right that Bela Lugosi coming along really kicked it up to a level that it had not been able to attain before. Probably had never dreamt of obtaining. Like it was probably doing as well as it could have done before Bela Lugosi came along.
Right. And then as soon as that movie dropped, then suddenly there was an image in
Mm.
everyone's heads of what Dracula looked like, what he sounded like, the presence, the charisma, all of those things that you don't that they're kind of in the book, but you don't necessarily get the whole sensory
Totally.
perception of the way that a movie can give it to you.
And here's how I can prove that to you, Sean. If you get on your phone right now and you go to your emoji settings and you type vampire, you don't get something that looks like Count Orlok. You don't get something that looks like
That's
Carmilla or
right.
Varney. You get something that looks like Bela Lugosi.
That's right. That is absolutely right. The high collar and the widow's peak and the yeah,
Sure.
no, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, not many
So
people get an emoji made to resemble them. Maybe Einstein and Bela Lugosi might be the two I can think of.
that's fantastic. So I guess in that regard, I mean it's probably pretty easy to say that like without Dracula, Bela Lugosi might not be a household name.
Oh gosh, no.
He probably would not have had a hit leading role that would have propelled him into stardom back in the 30s, because he had played Dracula in a version of the play
Sure.
before the movie came out, right? And
Yes,
so,
and that's how he got the job. If I remember my Hollywood lore correctly, he was not even the favorite to play the role in the movie, but he had played it on stage enough that eventually it just went to him. And he'd been a moderately successful actor in his home country for a long time. And I don't recall exactly when he made the leap. I know that there were some purges going on of unions and leftists, and he had to get out of his home country at that time. And somewhere along the way, he got into Dracula, and he couldn't even really do the lines because he couldn't read English, couldn't even speak it
oh,
that
right,
well. So
right.
he had all the lines written out for him phonetically. But I mean, a testament to his prowess and his magnetism on stage, that even though that's what he was dealing with, he still was a hit with the audiences. And that, of course, led to him getting that role when they finally adapted it to the screen.
So it seems like that was almost sort of like that was a custom built funnel for him to reach stardom. So like if he hadn't played Dracula on stage, and then Universal decided to make a movie of it, and I heard David J. Schall say in an interview that it was originally Lon Chaney was up for that part, and
He was.
had like soft accepted it 20 years earlier, but hadn't told anybody that he was dying of cancer, and um, so
That is
so
true.
so there's and maybe none of that would have any bearing on whether Bela Lugosi would eventually get the role or not. But it seems like if not for that very specific procession of events, he probably would not be anybody we are familiar with today. Like his name probably would not have come up in the film history books at all.
I think that that is probably true of every major superstar in history. It was this break, that break, just happened to get the right role with the right director that suited them, and now we know who they are forever.
Right. Yeah. No, it's a very good point.
But you brought up the Universal films, and it occurred to me that had Dracula not been written and not been adapted to the stage and then made into a movie, we probably would not have what we think of as the Universal horror,
You're
because
right.
it was only the success of Dracula that had Universal go, oh, we need to make a tilt towards horror back in the 1930s.
You're
I don't
right.
I don't know if they would have made Frankenstein. I don't Frankenstein was certainly a big hit, but would they have made it had they not first had that success with Dracula? That is a question that is kind of impossible to answer for sure. But I would suspect that maybe they wouldn't have, or maybe they wouldn't have put the resources into Frankenstein had Dracula not been the hit that it was. And then, therefore, maybe Frankenstein would have faltered and they never would have made The Mummy or The Invisible Man or Future from the Black
Yeah.
Lagoon or so many others.
Yeah. I mean, I'm kind of remembering back now to the interview that I did with David Scull, where he said, and I'd never realized this before, but that Universal was taking a risk with making Dracula, because up to that point they had never made a movie where there was an actual supernatural menace. There
Hmm.
was the end of the movie was always like, if it was a ghost story or if it was a monster story, it'd always turn out that it would be somebody in a mask, or a normal human being who is just disfigured or something like that. There was never a supernatural resolution to it.
Yeah, it was the
Un-
Scooby-Doo ending, right?
exactly. And Dracula was the first time that they did that, and because it was so popular and made them so much money, they were like, "Oh, what other monsters can we do?"
It's
But
curious. I am curious why that was the thing back in those days before Dracula, that they had to have, and even sometimes after Dracula. Remember, you may have seen Mark of the Vampire by now, great Bela
yes,
Lugosi film. That
right.
I'll spoil it. Um, the ending is ruined by that Scooby-Doo reveal. It's so haunting and atmospheric and beautiful and creepy until they have that reveal at the end that there was no monster.
Right, right. And that, I mean, that's another case of would that movie have been made had it not been for the success of Dracula?
Oh,
Because
absolutely not. No way.
yeah, because if I'm, and again, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I seem to recall that Mark of the Vampire was basically sort of just like a revamp. Did I make a pun there? A revamp of London After Midnight, which
Which starred who?
which starred Lon Chaney as
It,
the
it all
vampire.
comes it all and now Bela Lugosi replaces him again.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good point. Oh my God, I never thought about that. That's a. You're
Yeah.
right. You're right. I don't know if I had a point in there or not, but but all of that to say that like so much of what came after. I mean, is it hyperbole to say that we probably would never have gotten Nightmare on Elm Street had it not been for Dracula?
Whoa. Okay. That's the master's level thesis there. Explain that one. Run that one
Well,
down for me.
just the fact that because Dracula suddenly made it okay, the Universal Dracula made it suddenly okay for there to be actual supernatural stuff taking place in a horror movie, and that audiences showed that they were really drawn to horror movies to the point where Universal just started cranking them out. Other movie theaters started, or other movie distributors started making them, and that even though horror movies would kind of go in and out of fashion over the years, I feel like that all kind of traces back to Dracula in the fact that like when you have Freddy Krueger, who is a supernatural entity, a monster who clearly is magical in some particular way, and the fact that he exists in the dream world and stuff like that, does that trace its DNA back to that decision to make the Bela Lugosi Dracula?
That's interesting. I think you could get a PhD thesis with that one. Maybe, it was half a century later. We may have gotten there anyway,
That's a good point. Yeah.
but I think you do recognize the DNA that maybe a Nightmare on Elm Street would have not have come out when it did. Maybe it would have looked a little bit different. I think that is fair to say.
Yeah.
I'll go I'll say something bold. I think that every major vampire story I'm going to say post 1931 uh is influenced by Dracula with the possible exception of I Am Legend, because
Okay.
all those other vampires, they either model themselves on Dracula, and I'm talking about the Bela Lugosi version of Dracula,
Yeah.
that
Yeah. Yeah.
popular conception, or they specifically and consciously model themselves against it. There's so many lines in vampire stories where they'll say, "We aren't like those vampires that wear capes and turn into bats." And like, okay, well, you are clearly defining yourself against Dracula, so you clearly are being influenced by Dracula.
Yeah. Yeah. And that raises a very good question, is that was Anne Rice writing an anti-Dracula story in Interview with the Vampire? Or did that, I know that she had said that she was very influenced by Carmilla. Maybe Dracula did not inherently have any place in her thought process, but it certainly had to have been in the underlying
I
sort
think it.
of.
I don't have a window into Anne Rice's brain, but I cannot imagine that she would have embarked on writing the Vampire Chronicles had Dracula not existed. I have to believe that because of all the vampires that had come after Dracula, she recognized in that mythical creature the potential for what she wanted. And she drew some stuff from Carmilla, of course, but would it have even been on her radar had it not been for all the vampires that had come after Dracula that were influenced by Dracula? That she saw, oh, handsome, magnetic, hypnotic vampires that everyone finds just posh and dressed to the nines. And let's not forget, just they had an air of richness. Even if they weren't made of money, they had wealth, right, of some sort that they'd accumulated.
Right.
And they were beautiful. If she had written ugly vampires that slept in coffins together, I'd say, okay, maybe she was doing something completely different. But no.
But you're right. She did write very Byronic vampires.
Yes.
Almost every single character that was a vampire was very Byronic. Yeah. And
I want to be clear here. I want the Rice stands to come after me. Anne Rice did push it to a new place.
Oh, for sure.
In the same way that Stoker took what already existed in vampires and pushed it to a new place, Anne Rice did the same. In fact, I am fond of saying that the three pillars that vampire fiction rests on is Polidori, Stoker, and Rice. Yeah. So it wasn't like she was just doing a knockoff. She was going to new places, but she was also standing on the shoulders of what had come before her as well, just like Stoker did.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. That's a very good point. And on that very good point, let's throw in somebody who future historians may consider to be a fourth pillar, and that is Stephenie Meyer.
Okay, yeah.
Do we? I mean, you can't escape the gravity well that is Twilight and the effect that it has had on not only the book industry but just current sort of popular teenage media in general over the last, what are we into, like 20 years now or something, like 15 years since Twilight reached critical mass. Do we have Twilight without Dracula?
No.
There's no way, right?
No. Stephenie Meyer is on record saying she did not read or watch vampire movies. So how does she become aware of vampires at all? It's only because of the ubiquity of vampires that exists because of Dracula. Had Dracula not come along, remember what we were talking about at the very beginning of this, if Dracula had not come along and vampires were relegated to the same status as mummies in popular media, I don't think Stephenie Meyer writes a vampire novel for teens.
Yeah, that's a good point. And one can imagine that Stephenie probably watched a lot of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And just like everyone who was Gen X did. Maybe I'm putting that on everybody. I watched a lot of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, so maybe that wasn't everyone, but there certainly was no Buffy the Vampire Slayer without Dracula having existed, because that was another case of writing something that countered Dracula, that was that was commentary on vampire media. So yeah, I mean, without
am I right in thinking that the vampires of the Buffyverse would be killed in the same way that a Dracula would be killed?
Yeah, entirely. Like all of the rules applied, with the addition of sunlight.
Right.
So yeah, they basically had the entire grab bag of weaknesses. I don't know that there was ever any, vampires can't cross running water, or I don't think silver was a thing, but they were averted their eyes from crosses and holy objects, and holy water would burn them, and a couple of them could turn into animals, I think, or maybe I'm making that up. But Dracula himself appeared in season 3 of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Like he was the opening episode, I think.
Not looking Bela Lugosi-like at all, which I thought was a good choice.
Yeah, they definitely went a very Gary Oldman style with his look. Which, that's another good question, Brian. What about Gary Oldman's career? if not for Dracula?
I think Gary Oldman would have and did escape getting pigeonholed as Dracula. So many other actors fell into that trap. Lugosi being the most famous example. I think Christopher Lee had a hard time getting out of it. It wasn't until, correct me if I'm wrong, but it wasn't until late in his career that he kind of got rediscovered as not being the Dracula guy. But Gary
Right,
Oldman
right.
already had a very full and respected career as this guy who could be anybody, the ultimate chameleon. So by the time he did Dracula, he would already been Sid Vicious. He had already been Lee Harvey Oswald. He'd already
Oh
been
yeah.
any number of people. So I think he would have not gotten into that trap because of the state of his career. Had that been his first role, things may have worked out differently.
That's a good point. Yeah, I'm trying to remember back now, and I seem to recall that like immediately following Dracula, he was in Luc Besson's The Professional, and then he was in True Li no,
True
not
Light.
True Lies, True Romance, True Romance.
Yes, thank you.
He was playing a lot of villain roles, to be sure. Lost in Space, uh, but you're right. He definitely climbed out of that, and he didn't like. I feel like Gary Oldman didn't really talk about Dracula after the movie came out and the press tour was done, everything like that.
Yeah.
Like he didn't make any attempt to go back and sort of make any hay from that. Like, to try, like, no comedic appearances as Dracula. And it seemed like he felt like, okay, I've done that, but I'm an actor and I want to do everything. And
Right.
so yeah, you're probably right. We would probably know who Gary Oldman is today without Coppola's Dracula.
Right. And I think a lot of younger people don't realize that Coppola's Dracula was not all that well received when it first came out. It's kind of grown in stature and reputation in the intervening decades, but I remember it coming out and it was kind of panned and it didn't do great at the box office.
You may be right. You may be right. I have some serious rose-colored glasses when it comes to that movie, and having gone to see it while I was in college, but I certainly was not aware of like at that time like how well movies did, or how successful they were, or anything like that. So I would totally believe that.
Well, someone can maybe run the numbers and tell me if I'm right or wrong, but that's my recollection of it, is that it was kind of a tepid response. It wasn't hated, but it certainly wasn't groundbreaking. It was no Silence of the Lambs, or trying to think of other horror movies that
That's a
came
very
out
good
in the
point.
90s that
Yeah,
made a
that's a very good
big
point.
splash like that.
Yeah. No, that's a real good point. Interesting.
I think the Kenneth Branagh Frankenstein, which that came out the next year, I think
Oh,
that,
right. Yeah.
because I think they were trying to recapture that fire in the bottle that Universal had in the 30s. And they're like, okay,
Yeah.
let's do it in the same order. They released Dracula and then they released a new Frankenstein. And I would guess if it had done really well, they would have maybe kept going with it.
I know that they were both Sony movies, and
Hmm.
Sony, with the success of Dracula, was like, oh, well, maybe we can do what Universal did, except, modern.
Right.
And I remember when I first moved out here and I was desperate to get a job, and I was schlepping my resume around town and getting lots of, being ignored completely. The thing that all of us did when you were trying to get that first job was you would go out, you would buy a copy of the Hollywood Reporter every, I think, Wednesday, and in it there would be a list of all of the movies that had just gone into production that week. But one of them was the Van Helsing Chronicles, and it was
Oh.
starring Anthony Hopkins, and it was in pre-production to be a sequel to Coppola's Dracula that was going to follow Anthony Hopkins as Van Helsing.
I have never heard of this. This is fascinating.
Yeah. I mean,
And
it
I'm
may be
so
something.
angry that it never got made.
I know, exactly. I'm dying to know, like, who do I ask to like get the backstory on like what was gonna happen in that movie?
So
But
that means
yeah,
somewhere, Sean, somewhere there's a script that was written for it.
oh, there has to be. Yeah, there has to
Wow.
be. And I don't know
I wonder
if
if we could track down who that screenwriter was and find out what the hell it was supposed to be about.
I bet if it wasn't James Hart who wrote the first Dracula movie,
Hmm.
I bet he would know who was writing that one. I would have to assume that he would remember because like if somebody is hired to write the sequel to something you made, you definitely you know who that person is.
So my first thought is to go check the credits of the Van Helsing film that came out with Hugh Jackman and see if there's any names anywhere down the story by list that were in common with the Coppola Dracula film, because I could totally see it being the case that they tried to make Van Helsing Chronicles with Anthony Hopkins. It got shelved, and then someone pulled out the script many years later with Hugh Jackman and said, let's make it again, but change everything.
Oh, that's interesting. It would have to have jumped studios if that were the case.
Oh, is that okay?
Because I
Okay.
think because the Hugh Jackman Van Helsing was one of Universal's attempts at getting the Universal monsters back up and going again.
Right,
Uh,
but that was what they called the Dark Universe, right?
well, that was actually that came later. That was after the Marvel universe had spun up and was doing so well, and everybody was like, "Oh, we want a movie universe," and Universal was like, "We've already got all these properties lying
Yeah.
around. Let's just do this." And they the first movie was going to be the Tom Cruise Mummy, but right before, like the year before the Mummy premiered, Universal was distributing Dracula Untold by Legendary Pictures, and they liked the movie so much that they were like, you know what? Let's reshoot the ending of it and have it be the start of the Dark Universe.
Mm.
And so they shot a new ending for it that takes place modern day, where Luke Evans, shows up as Dracula.
I remember that, and I wondered what their plan had been with that little tease at the end of that film.
I have a feeling that it was probably just a let's get it in there and we'll figure out what it all means later,
Hmm.
because it was such a late addition to it, and Dracula Untold was made by a completely different filmmaking group than the Dark Universe. But sadly, Dracula Untold came out, and I think I was the only person in the theater that opening weekend who was watching it, and so they were like, "Oh yeah, you know what? Never mind. This is the Dark Universe starts with the Mummy. This
Yeah.
was never part of it."
But
All
people
of these
forget, though,
chances.
the original Universal films was kind of the first unified universe,
That's a good point. That's a
not
good
not
point.
not executed as well as the MCU, but there was
For
a
sure. For
continuity
sure.
between those films that they started to figure out after a while. And they had some choppy moments, but you would see the same characters show up sometimes in across films. And by the
Yeah.
time you get to the Abbott and Costello, they're all coming together and having their monster mashes.
Yeah. What that
Speaking of which, Sean, getting back to your original point, no Dracula, no monster mash.
Oh,
You
that's
get
a
no,
good
you don't get
point.
your 1960s bubblegum horror doesn't happen. You probably don't get like the Scooby-Doo craze or anything like that. You don't get the groovy ghoulies.
That's
You
a
don't get
very good point.
that 1960s reaction to the horror industry of the 30s, which is treating it like fun. Not unlike Freddy Krueger is now kind of fun now.
Yes. That's a very good point, Brian.
You certainly
Yeah.
don't get Count Chocula. That does not happen.
Oh, they get Count Chocula. You're right. We wouldn't have Count Chocula.
We don't have Count Von Count.
That's
Uh,
true. That's
what else?
true.
Yeah, a lot of those things. We lose all of them if we lose Dracula.
That is a very good point. That is a
But
very
you know
good
what?
point. I mean,
Maybe we'd have Carmela's caramels or something like that instead.
oh my Has no one ever thought of that before?
Hang on, we
That's
got to copyright
amazing.
this episode.
You guys, so 10 years from now when we're rich off of Carmilla's caramels, this is the moment where it happened.
That's right.
Oh my God, that's amazing. You're right. It is just kind of a Pandora's box that you open of like all of these things. Well, like we would. I mean, there would be no Vampirella. There would be no, there would be like all of the different, like League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. There would not have been, the character of Mina would not have been in there.
You probably, I think you could make a fair argument that you don't get Elvira or Vampira
Oh
without the
yeah,
success of Dracula.
absolutely, absolutely.
Because I mean, you could make some inferences about the style and tastes not being there, but then you could draw a direct line and say, no Dracula, no Bela Lugosi, no Mark of the Vampire, no Carol Borland and Mark of the Vampire, who kind of pioneers that look that
Right.
Elvira and Vampira later on fight over, like they invented it when she was doing it long before either one of them.
That's a good point.
And maybe you don't have all those horror movies for them to be the hosts of. So, goth girls have to come up with a completely new wardrobe if there's no Dracula. That's
That's
what I'm getting at
amazing.
here. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, that's a good point. God, I wasn't even thinking about the fashion aspects of No Dracula.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think Dracula really talks about wardrobe a whole lot. I think that there's a
No.
little bit of a description of what Dracula's wearing when Harker first meets him, and maybe there's a little description later on, but it doesn't linger on it.
Yeah, there was one because I read Dracula for the first time very late in life, having already seen like all the movies and everything like that, and I was amazed in the book. There's the one chapter where Harker and Mina are back in London and they see Dracula for the first time on the streets of London. He looks younger, and Dracula does not see them. And Dracula sees the girl wearing the pinwheel hat and walks after her as she's leaving. And the implication is that, he's going to go drink her blood. But Stoker describes him as wearing like a what did he say? It was like a
Was
it
it,
was
it was
like
a straw hat?
a straw hat.
Yeah, that's
He's
right.
wearing
I forgot about that.
which is not goth at all.
No,
That's
it should be. We should make that the thing. I'm going to a Gothic music festival in a week. I'm gonna bring in the straw hat. And when anyone questions me on it, I'm gonna say I am very traditionally goth. Your black
that's
parasol
amazing.
does not belong here. This is
Yes,
trad goth here.
exactly. This predates all everything you're wearing. Well, okay. So on that point, let me ask you perhaps one of the most important questions. If there had been no Dracula, what does that mean for your life?
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, I'm going to answer that in a roundabout way.
Okay.
When I first started getting interested in delving into vampires more, I consciously tried to avoid Dracula because I thought to myself, this book has been studied. Uh, Everyone has written about it. There's been so much analysis of it. I have nothing to contribute to that conversation. And I don't want to be overly influenced by it. I want to try to talk about other things about vampires. And after a couple of years of trying that, I realized that there's no way. You can't deal with vampires post Dracula without acknowledging the influence. And it's really hard to talk about vampires pre Dracula without acknowledging that these all kind of lead up to where
That's a good
Dracula
point. That's a good
had
point.
that sort of pivot point in vampires, vampirology, vampire literature.
Yes, absolutely.
So, I think without Dracula, I would have a harder time making a 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon chart with vampires. I think that Dracula is kind of that linchpin that ties these webs that kind of go off in different directions. They all kind of come in together in this one little point here, and then they spread out again, both in the past and in the future.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very good answer. Yeah, you're making me remember back to, like, I definitely, had seen the a couple of the Dracula movies when I was a kid. Bela Lugosi and Frank Langella's versions. Um, but my big introduction was The Lost Boys, and to a 13-year-old kid who's watching The Lost Boys, like, you're like, yeah, this is amazing, and like Fright Night and stuff, and there was no Dracula anywhere visibly in those movies to me as a kid. Like, now, as somebody who has studied, vampire media and stuff like that, I can see the influences all over the place. But back then, I was like, yeah, Dracula's like just this goofy dude in a cape, but like these are sexy teenagers who become like these monsters, and it's taking place nowadays. But then Coppola's Dracula came out when I was in college, and then suddenly seeing that movie and being like, oh my God, wait, this is what Dracula actually is about? Because I had never seen a version of it that felt like it really looked steeped in Victorian location and costume and stuff, and with all of the blood and the sex and the and the werewolf and the like, all the, like, it was just this onslaught of like, oh my God, this is so cool. So yeah, you're right. Like, I definitely came to it from a very roundabout way as well, coming back around to it and being like, oh wait, no, this is important.
And I think that that's probably not uncommon with people our age, where we would have encountered the Lost Boys before we ever would have watched a Dracula movie, and with younger people who would come across Twilight first, and maybe some of them get interested enough to learn a little bit more about vampires, and then work backwards to Dracula, or even further back, depending on how much they want to dig. But yeah, I think everyone's going to have their own sort of entry point to it.
That's cool. Yeah, an entry point that is sort of more convenient and more relevant to their interests at whatever that moment in time is.
Mm-hmm.
But clearly, Dracula is a universal enough of a story to where, and a universal enough of a novel to draw people back to it and to really enjoy the source material.
One thing I've admired about the book is if you start reading academic papers on it, you'll realize that people can view it through so many lenses.
Yeah.
You can look at Dracula as being a feminist text or an anti-feminist text. You can look at it as being a racist text or an anti-colonialist text. You can look at it as being xenophobic. You can look at it as being homoerotic or homophobic. There's all these different lenses you can pick up and use to view Dracula. I don't know which one's the correct one, or if there is a correct one, but there's so much in the book that you can find. It's sort of like that whole thing about the devil can quote the scripture for his own purposes.
Right.
But there's a lot to be mined in the book.
That's a very good point. Yeah, that's what, and I don't think I've ever heard anybody sort of pull all that together in one statement like you just did there.
And I don't know that anyone's ever, and that's me like doing a big overview of all the academic study of it. I don't know that anyone's done an academic study where they pull all that together. That would be a very thick book.
Yeah, that's a good point. Although I have a feeling that if we were to, bring that up at the Children of the Night Congress this year, there would probably be several presenters there who are like, "Oh yeah, I teach all that stuff in my class. Like that's all in there."
Yeah, let's do that. Let's find out.
Okay. This is I should let everybody know. I mean, if you're watching this channel, you've probably already heard me talk about the Children of the Night Congress for the past 2 years. But Brian is a regular presenter there, and if you're okay, I just really, the fact that Brian and I have never actually sat down for a long conversation together, I have a bunch of questions that I just want to ask him about him. And since I think we have pretty clearly adjudicated A World Without Dracula now, I hope you will indulge me to ask him a couple questions and find out about his influences in his life. But one of the things that Brian did this last year was he completely stole the entire Congress by this reveal that he had discovered what it sounds like is the very first fictional account of a vampire in literature. Could you take just a couple, and like he's done an entire episode about this on his channel. Please go watch that episode. It's fantastic. Please go watch his channel. There will be a link to it below. I'll put a link up here. But can you just talk to us real quick about sort of what you found?
Well, last year, 2023, was the 275th anniversary of the first vampire poem, Der Vampir, by Heinrich Ossenfelder. And originally, I just wanted to do sort of a recognition, hey, how about this? Maybe we talk about this poem a little bit. I started looking into his biography because there's almost nothing out there about this poet. Okay. And I started to dig up some stuff, and I was really impressed with myself, all these birth records and baptism records I was finding.
Oh my God.
And then it was Hans de Roos who said to me, I think that let me back up a second. Der Vampir is published in a journal, and it's a very short poem at the end of a very long article about vampires. And it's Hans de Roos who says to me, this article about vampires was not original to the journal. They stole this from a French text, which I never knew. I assumed that it was original, written by the editor. So then I started backtracking and saying, okay, well, let's figure out where this article was taken from. It was taken from a French text called Lettres Juives, the Jewish letters, that was written 12 years earlier. And what was really striking is that the Jewish letters is actually a work of fiction. So it is discussing vampires between two fictional characters. It is portrayed in the journal that Der Vampir was published in. It was portrayed as an editorial or an essay, where the source material was really two fictional characters having a discussion. So what that means is that vampires first get talked about in a work of fiction in 1736. What's disappointing about it to you and me and everybody else is that there's not an actual vampire in this work of fiction. In fact, what this piece of fiction does is the two characters are basically saying, can you believe what these people are doing over in Serbia and Romania? They're digging up graves. This is what they believe. That can't possibly be true. There can't actually be vampires. So it's a little bit of a technicality, but it is the first time that anyone's found, that I am aware of, that a piece of fiction brings up vampires. Before that, it had only been nonfiction that discussed vampires in any way. And the asterisk there, of course, is that some will argue that there is much older Greek texts that have creatures that are vampiric.
Sure.
With acknowledging that, I would just counter that those share qualities with what we recognize as vampires. But sure. I think it is an error to say that this belief system that was native to Eastern Europe was the same belief system that was existing in these much, much, much older texts.
Yeah. I would absolutely echo all of that. I think that's very legitimate to say. But that is fantastic. And so, I mean, you're talking about finding the birth certificate of somebody who was born 250 years ago or something like that?
Yeah, well, baptism record. I shouldn't say birth certificate. I found the baptism record for the poet, which was a coup. That was a coup in itself. Because then now I have his father's name, which means maybe I can find out some family information.
I mean, this is crazy to me. Like how, like where I cannot for the life of me imagine where I would even start to go and like I would literally go to Google and say baptism record for Heinrich Ossenfelder, but like where did you learn how to do all this, and where were you bitten by the bug to do this kind of in-depth historical research?
There is a little bit of serotonin that gets released in my brain when I'm doing that sort of thing. Uh, it's somehow it's fun in a sick way. Um, I found out when I was reading Vampira's biography that she spent some time in Minnesota. So of course I had to figure out where she lived, and after enough time, I was able to find the apartment building in Duluth, Minnesota, up the street from me,
Oh my
where she
God.
lived. Yeah, I've got some photos. I'll send them to you. It's a disaster zone, the building. I wish I was a drone operator so I could have like flown a drone through the windows that don't exist anymore and
Oh
over the roof that
wow.
is caved in so I could actually get some footage of the
Oh
place she would have
wow.
grown up. But
It's a
neither
true
here nor
haunted
there.
house now.
Yeah, it is definitely roped off and boarded up. But
Wow.
if you're the adventurous type, you could probably climb up and get through one of the windows that has no glass in it.
But that
But I'm
was
I'm,
that
I'm
was sort
getting
of the
off your
start of it.
question. Um, I really lucked out when I was researching Ossenfelder that somewhere along the way I figured out what school he went to, what high school he went to, and I can't remember how I figured that out, but I wrote to the school directly because this is one of those schools that's been around for 500 years in Germany. That's nothing to
Right.
them.
Right.
They
Right.
have all kinds of buildings that are that old. And so I wrote to them and I said, I'm trying to do a research paper about one of your alumni, and as fortune would have it, two things were true. He was in the same graduating class as one of the most famous poets in German history, Gotthold Lessing. So there's a lot written about Gotthold Lessing. So he's got a contemporary, which
Gotcha.
helps me paint a picture of Ossenfelder. And I also happened to strike up a friendship with the librarian of the school, who dug up these papers, these books that you would not find online anywhere, that just had basically accounts of the students who had attended the school, and a paragraph about each of them. And so suddenly I was had only one paragraph, but that one paragraph was all brand new information to me.
Oh my
And
God.
then one more big piece of luck, as it turned out, this Gotthold Lessing, who I just mentioned, wrote for the same journal that Ossenfelder's Der Vampire appeared in. And digging through some biographies of Lessing, it turns out that him and Ossenfelder were friends. They hung out. So now all of a sudden, I'm able to trace the goings on and the lifestyle of Ossenfelder because Lessing's life was so well documented. Even though he's way in the shadows, and even though he's a footnote, there is so much more information than there was before because of just the social circle that he happened to be appended to.
That is fascinating. Oh my God.
Yeah,
I
a
mean,
lot of
what a
lucky
stroke
breaks.
of luck, but also that shows some serious outside of the box research thinking on your part to be able to go to those lengths and to find those threads to pull on. That's really impressive.
It was fun to sit and think about where to go. And and like I said, the librarian at the St. Afra School was of tremendous help to me. He recommended places that I could go try that I never would have imagined. He said, "Have you tried the German Romantic Museum?" What's the German Romantic Museum?
The what?
Maybe I should write to them and see what they have. So, not being a native German speaker or a German speaker in any capacity meant I was very limited, but having some allies helped a lot. Like having Hans and having Thomas was a godsend to have people like that who were native German speakers and could think of resources that would not have even occurred to me.
Interesting. That's
And I have
very
to, I'll
cool.
I'll give Hans one more piece of credit because I found the death record for Ossenfelder, and it was handwritten, so it's really hard to read. And I sent it to him and I said, there's a word in here that I can't figure out what this is supposed to either be or mean. And because Hans is a native German speaker, he said, oh, I think you found the cause of Ossenfelder's death, which was not known before. This is an archaic word for a stroke that no one uses anymore, but this would indicate that he died of a
Whoa.
stroke. So things like that were kind of godsends and brainbusters at the same time.
You just settled a cold case that's almost
Right.
300 years old. That's amazing. Wow. Well, and one of the things that I have regularly been impressed about when it comes to you is your ability to sort of make those connections and make those friendships with people that you're researching, to where you're able to get information details that otherwise are not known outside of outside in academia or the internet or anything like that. And I've watched you do that while researching the movie Blacula, which I had alluded to earlier on. But so Brian has done interviews with the director of Blacula, the screenwriter of Blacula. I noticed him posting one night on Facebook saying that he was in a hotel room scanning tons of memorabilia from the production of Blacula, and I was like, "Oh my God, are you in LA right now? I'll come over and totally help you with that." And you were like, "No, I'm in Santa Fe or something like that."
Right, right.
So so just because I'm curious, where like how did you uh, get so obsessed with Blacula, and where is this leading you to?
I'll try to answer this question as precisely as I can. I'm kind of fascinated with things that are firsts in vampires, as you might know from like 5 seconds ago, that whole discussion.
Yes, exactly. It's pretty evident.
And somewhere along the way, I became aware of Blacula as being, at that time, I thought it was the first black vampire. Later, we learned that's not true, but at the time, I thought it was. Um, and as I started looking into the movie, I realized, oh, there's a lot of things this movie did before any other vampire film or maybe any horror film. And at least on one count that I can think of, something it had done before any film, period. And so I started thinking, well, gosh, Blackula doesn't get the credit it deserves for being so pioneering. And I kind of looked around for writings on it, and there was a little bit, but not nearly as much as I thought there should be. And maybe this should be my calling to dig into this film and maybe celebrate it and bring it to awareness more than it already is. Because as you know, Blacula is kind of a punchline. You bring up the word Blacula and people laugh.
Yeah.
When I tell people I'm very interested in Blacula, they're like, Blacula. And fair enough. It's a silly title, but it's a serious film. And even though it was, made cheap and it's got some drawbacks of having been made in the era it was made in, it still is punching way above its weight class. And the further my interest got into the film, the more I appreciated what it was doing and what it was trying to do. Uh, the second part of your question was, where's all this going? Um, Originally, I thought it was going to end with, an interview or two and a paper and a presentation. It seems to be the gift that keeps on giving. It is that dark gift that makes you hungry for things that you'll never get, much like Blacula is cursed with. So right now, I am trying to complete a short documentary on William Crane, the director of Blacula. Um,
This is the first time I'm hearing about this, by the way. I'm very excited about this.
well, it's so close, Sean. Every time I sit down with it, I keep seeing things that aren't quite right,
Mm,
and kind of working on it on my own without any kind of other production support. I feel like it's slower because there's fewer eyes to say, hey, that belongs there, or
sure.
that's the wrong shot to cut to. So I'm having to go back and look at that and second guess myself and try to get it right. There's also not there's areas where there's not nearly enough B-roll or imagery. So I'm having to kind of figure out ways to creatively get around that. Some of that is
Gotcha.
creating a lot of original artwork, and some of that is copyright infringement, just to have something to cut to. Uh, you can bleep that out, right?
I can totally bleep that out. Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Hopefully I
and I
remembered to do that.
hopefully this will result in a book at some point.
Oh,
I was
okay.
at a conference a couple weeks ago where I was presenting about Ossenfelder, and I talked to some publishers about this idea of basically the handbook of Blacula, because nothing like that exists right now. There are articles about Blacula, there's mentions of Blacula in other books, but there's not a resource that uh, tells the full story of how it came to be and its reception, or really a long form analysis outside of a couple very good papers that exist, but nothing that's really accessible to the public, really. So I would like to be able to complete that. My New Year's resolution is to start that book this year. Um, but every time I sit down, I think I got to finish the Crane documentary. There's too many things. I've got to finish this thing and then
Right,
start that
right,
thing.
right.
So every time I try to write something about Blacula, I always feel like I'm backpedaling later because I'll here's a funny story. In 2021, 2022, I was writing and doing a bunch of videos about Blacula. And at that time, there was a couple things, without revealing, there was a couple things I believed to be true about the making of the film. And I had no reason to doubt it. It had seemingly been verified. I stated it very loudly. And I have since read the same statement stated just almost in the same language I used in other places. And I've now learned that I was wrong. I was completely wrong. Um, it wasn't because I was making things, I had bad information that I
Yeah,
was
yeah, totally,
going off
totally.
of. And I suspect there are people who read what I wrote and echoed it and were also just as wrong. So eventually I'm going to have to tell them, hey, everybody, this is incorrect. And we're going to have to all use ourselves as examples of people who got this information dead wrong.
But I love that. I love the fact that not only are you, somebody who's able to say, "Oh, I was totally wrong about that. Here's the correct version that I've found out." Like that's just how science works. But
Sure.
but also the fact that you have delved deep enough into this stuff to have been able to to be able to hear from the people who actually were there what the real story was.
Hmm.
And there's, I mean, I invite everybody to go obviously check out Brian's channel, but there's an incredible episode that he does where he gets the director and the writer from Blacula together on a Zoom call, and it is the first time they have spoken or seen one another since they made that movie. And like you just get to watch them sort of in real time. What has it been, 55 years since that movie
It
came
had
out?
been 50 years at the time that we recorded that. It had been 50 years.
Yeah, that is crazy. And they're just like they're relaying stories back and forth to one another that neither one of them were aware of at the
Hmm.
time. And so you're just like seeing this magical, like
And not
they're
all
both.
those stories are good. Some of those stories are
That's
very painful.
yes, yes, that is true. That is very true. And definitely a sign of what the movie industry was back
Hmm.
in the early 70s, late 60s.
Yeah, 72 would have been when the film came out. And gosh, they may have filmed it the same year. Did they start it in 71? They made movies very fast back then.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So it is definitely you're right. Like there are a couple stories that are very very hard to hear, but to your point are important to hear.
Yes, yes, agreed.
Be, not only because that all happened, but because we need to. And somebody who works in the movie industry, like it's very important to know what the actual history of your industry is, what artists had to deal with
Hmm.
who, the people who have come before you.
And
So,
that's part of, I think, my passion for Blacula is it's not it's 40% in the movie, but it's 60% everything around the movie.
yeah.
The circumstances that it was made in and the influence that it had later. That's the real impact of it. As a standalone film, if you showed it to a film student today, they'd say like, "What's the big deal?" But when you understand the cultural impact that it had and what it took to get that movie made, suddenly you have to appreciate it on a profound level.
Yeah, that's a very good way of putting it. I am very excited for your documentary and book whenever you get around to finishing both or either of them. Uh, just because I'm curious, it's kind of inside baseball, but do you see this documentary as being something that like this should go around to festivals? Or is
That
this a straight to YouTube kind of thing?
that is probably its destination is festivals.
Okay.
Um, it's a labor of love, and I definitely had to spend a few bucks to make it, but it was never going to be a financial success. No one's buying short
Oh,
documentaries.
right, exactly,
But
clearly. But I would argue that it's better that way. It's better that it's a labor of love for you, because otherwise you would not have come across all the stuff that you have. You wouldn't have
Sure.
worked on this for 5 years now, or however long it's been. Uh, it's also
I,
got to be nice to not have a distributor leaning over your shoulder, being like, "Okay, when is this done?" Like you can
or
just
maybe it would be done if I did. But you're right. Sean, you said something. It was at the Children of the Night Congress that it resonated with me, and you said it better than I had ever been able to say it before. And I don't know if you remember this, but you said something to the effect of, "I feel like I'm creating a record for future generations. Someone will be a vampirologist in 20 years and they will need resources and they'll be able to go to your channel and see these interviews with people who have important stories to tell that won't be around to tell those stories in 20 years. And you're creating that archive, that memory for someone in the future." And on my best days, I feel like that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, and I would argue that you are really succeeding at that, and that was one of the things that was one of the moments when I saw you interviewing William Crane. That's where it all kind of hit home for me. I was like, oh shit, Brian is now like in real time as I watch this, he is establishing history uh, for every term paper that gets written from here on into infinity. This is now the words of the director are being spoken from his mouth into a camera for everyone, every film historian for the rest of time to be able to access with there's no hearsay, it is 100% from the source, and Brian made that happen. And part of that is the magic of YouTube, and
Mhm.
part of that is the magic of just the democratization of video equipment in general. But it's also you recognizing that this is this story would die with him if
100%.
you hadn't showed up 50 years after the fact to say, how did you make this? And
100%. Yeah.
that's really, it's really impressive. It's really important. It,
Uh,
I
Yeah, and,
think.
and it goes even further. And I'm not trying to be a a plug fest here, but in the documentary, it goes even further. There were things that I never knew about him and his life that have a big part of the story. And I'm not just talking about like, when I was a kid, this happened, but as we started doing the interview, I went into it thinking, okay, this is going to be a story about this director who had to probably fight against some discrimination to make this film and be the first Black horror director. that's a story, right? We've got the story. Let me just get the material. And then he starts talking, and I'm learning things that happened after Blacula that had a profound influence on Black horror today, but
Oh,
that ended up hurting him. So I used this phrase. I couldn't get him to say it, but the phrase I thought was, "Boy, you really laid down on the wire for the next generation with these undertakings you took on after Blacula had been made." And it kind of became the bookends of the whole documentary is
wow.
is setting up how he made these sacrifices and then telling that story later on. Something that I've never seen on a Wikipedia page. I haven't seen that in any article. Nothing he's ever talked about publicly until this. So it really is kind of first, not first person. What's the first, primary source
Yeah,
material,
yeah, yeah,
primary source history.
yeah. Yeah, I can't help but wonder, like, when David Scull was talking about how Murnau never gave an interview about Nosferatu.
What a
And
shame.
I'm just like, if only YouTube had been around then. If only Brian Forrest had been around back then. Like he we would have all these
Well,
answers to Nosferatu.
yeah, but then I would have had to have lived through the 30s.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah,
Good point.
in Germany. I don't, let's be careful what we wish for.
Yeah, exactly. So there's one more question I want to ask you that is sort of goes to all of this, and that is, it's clear from having watched however many episodes you've posted of Toothpickings that that one, you seem to have a performer's personality, and you also seem to have an education in production video technology. And I'm just wondering, what in your background is there that led you to being the guy that you are, who is talking about vampires on the internet in such a succinct and entertaining way?
My high school speech coach would be thrilled that you say I have a performer's personality. I was a speech kid back in high
Okay.
school. Yes, I loved it. It was kind of the center of my high school career, and it. I joined up because I was told that if you join the speech team, you'll never be scared of speaking again. And they were proved right because it became a lot easier to get up in front of an audience and talk after that point. But to your second question, I was a film student, University of Iowa.
What?
Some very talented and people's names who you would know were all in my class together, and I'm continually kind of chasing their tails, trying to be as good as Marcus Dunstan or Diablo Cody or Brian Volkweiss, who went on to have amazing careers. Um, but I now still do video production professionally, and so while my stuff does not look as good as your channel, and don't deny it, your stuff does look really good. I feel like I have to have like I felt like because there was a chance that clients or other people I worked with would see these videos, I had to at least have good sound. I had to at least have decent lighting, if nothing else, so that they would say, "Hey, you aren't really much of anything without a gaffer on set, are you?" I'm like, "No, listen, I know, I get how to do 3-point lighting. I know a little bit."
Dude, that 100% mimics like all of the how-to YouTube channels that I was watching before starting this channel were like, nobody's even gonna watch your first 100 videos anyway. Just like sit down in front of a camera and just do whatever. It doesn't make any difference. And I was like, it kind of makes a difference for me. Like if some future employer is like, well, let's look this guy up and find some shitty ass YouTube video, they're gonna be like, that's not who we're gonna hire.
Right.
So, so I 100% understand that.
On the other hand, I think I would probably make a lot more videos if every time I have a bunch of like notes on little tooth pickings videos I'd like to do, and then I sit and I think, I should go make this. I should do this tonight. And then I think, oh, I'm gonna have to spend 90 minutes setting up lights and setting up sound and testing it and getting
Yeah.
it wrong and then cutting it all together. No, I should really go work on my William Crane documentary. That's what I should be doing.
That's absolutely, absolutely, and I'm glad. But obviously, I would love to see more toothpicking episodes. I will be first in line for that. But I 100% appreciate the fact that like you recognize what it is your heart wants you to be doing, and that you go and do that, as opposed to like going somewhere and trying to like feed the beast. So.
Right. I hope that I'll get back to doing it more. I don't think it'll ever be as prolific as it was during the pandemic, where I was doing one a week because what the fuck else was there to do? But I would love to get back to a place where I'm doing one, every other month or so.
That's cool. Well, if it happens to get to that point, I will be very excited to watch.
Well, you might be finding a link to a rough cut of a William Crane documentary in your inbox one of these days very soon, because I need some other eyeballs on it, and I think you probably have good instincts for that sort of thing.
Oh, wow. I would love to see wherever your cut is at. That is fantastic. I mean, I'm probably just going to fangirl all over it, so I don't know that any input
No,
that
I can't.
is going to be very worth
I
it.
don't want any of that. I need some harsh reality.
Yes, no, I will be very excited to see that link. I wish I could share with all of you guys, but whenever, trust me, whenever Brian's done with this, I will be talking about it on this channel, so you will know how to be able to see it. And thank you, Brian. We've been talking for almost an hour and a half now, and I know that you have a whole life and everything, so I'll go ahead and wrap this up. But but thank you very much for taking the time. It has been great just having some time to talk to you. And also talking about a world without Dracula. That's
yeah, that was a good discussion. I feel like there was more we probably could have mined, but I think we had some good stuff there. I hope that people will watch your channel and like comment some other thoughts on this.
That's a very good point.
We weren't even
That's a
thinking
very good point. Please put that down in the comments, everybody. We're gonna love to hear the stuff that you come up with.
All right, Sean, thank you so much for having this wonderful discussion.
Oh man, it has been great having you here. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. Oh, that was so much fun. Thank you very much, Brian Forrest, for taking so much time to have this little academic discussion. Thank you, all of you, for watching it. I just have a couple of quick announcements here at the end. I just found out that I will be going back to Comic-Con this year. My panel, Comic-Con Film School, is going to be happening. Time, date, room still to be announced, but if you happen to be going to Comic-Con, please come by and say hello. It would be great to meet you in person and just to say, hey, what's up? Also, if you randomly want to hear me talk about something other than vampires, I've just appeared on the Leadership podcast talking about the leadership lessons from the Dune movies. Because, that Baron Harkonnen had some interesting ideas about office culture. So, if you want to check that out, I'll put the link up here. But otherwise, happy Dracula Day, everybody. Even if it's a little bit late. We'll see you next time.